Welcome everyone on behalf of the Center for Nonviolent Solutions. We are a small nonprofit committed to peace education, and that takes many expressions, working with after school and in-school programs, but also hosting programs like this one, which are directed to the general public, and are intended to highlight nonviolent options to various struggles that we have as human beings. I just want to recognize Rochelle Perrette, who's our wonderful administrator, and she's doing the tech work tonight, and to thank our chair of the board, Sean Minahan, who's here with us, and others from the center. We really are a team. The work is done collectively, and it's just a joy to work with all of them. Tonight, we want to have an informal roundtable discussion on how to address gun violence. The idea for this event was percolating in my head earlier this fall, but the circumstances didn't align until the very last minute to put this together. And yet it is the appropriate minute. It's the appropriate time, because we are convening 48 hours after a 15-year-old boy in a suburban high school killed of, hold on, if everyone could stay muted. I'm going to just take a minute. So Rochelle, if you could mute all. There we go. I think we have one person who's not muted. There we go. We're gathering in the wake of yet another school shooting. In this instance, a 15-year-old who used a gun purchased by his father. And we're also gathering in the wake of the Rittenhouse ruling. As all of you know, Kyle Rittenhouse, 17 years old, armed with a semi-automatic weapon, was sort of a self-appointed vigilante in demonstrations that were happening in Waukesha, Wisconsin in the summer of 2020. And the ruling on that case was discouraging for those of us who work for nonviolent social change and see protest as a key tool. And I recommend for all of you to please, if you can, look at the Washington Post editorial by Professor Alexandra Filindria that came out in the last couple of days, but she speaks very of a survey that she conducted in the wake, actually over the past year. And the survey looks at American attitudes towards bringing guns to protest. And the majority of Americans don't want that, thank God. But she notes at the end of the editorial the impact of guns on social protest and what it will mean for groups who feel too intimidated to come out and use this form of speech that Americans have used for centuries to communicate the change that they desire and to communicate that nonviolently. So this is why the center is specifically concerned about the development of gun access in our country right now, especially what it means for nonviolent social change. We're very happy to have with us this evening Representative Decker, who should be joining us soon. She represents the constituency of Cambridge and has been a co-sponsor of several important gun bills. So we want, in our discussion with her, to look at legislative action on addressing gun violence. And we're also so pleased to have two members of Moms Demand Action. Joanna McGugan is the co-leader with Dr. Peter McCarnity for the Central Mass chapter. And they will be speaking about, I've asked Joanna to tell us about the campaigns that Moms Demand Action are involved in, And since Dr. McCarnity is a physician, I've asked that he speak on gun violence as a form of, as not a form, but as a public health threat. And we're so pleased that Dr. Hirsch, who is the Director of Public Health for Worcester, is with us this evening. So a shout out to you, Dr. Hirsch. And when we get to talking about gun violence as a public health problem, and it truly is, we certainly want to hear from you as well, Dr. Hirsch. So do we have Representative Decker? If we don't, we're going to go right to Moms Demand Action, and we'll bring in.
Yes, Claire, please here.
There we do.
Oh, we do. Okay, wonderful. I'm sorry, I didn't see on the list. So Representative Decker, we would welcome so much if you could just inform us about your sponsorship of two bills, in particular, the one addressing ghost guns. If you can talk a little bit about what are ghost guns, and then also your support for a recent bill that restricts the manufacturing of semi-automatic weapons for individuals. It's the bill that got our friends Smith and Wesson in Springfield all in a huff. And I don't have much sympathy for them. So that's my bias.
They're not in a huff. That was all fake. That was drama. That was theatrics on their part. It really was.
So please welcome. I'm going to pass the spotlight to you. Tell us about these bills, and welcome. We're so glad you could make time to.
So thank you. It's nice to be here with you. I will tell you, although it looks like we will continue doing this very hybrid way of coming together, and maybe more virtual over the next couple of months than together in person, I miss the energy of actually being with you and being with people. And but still really grateful we have this opportunity to feel connected. And thank you for your interest in this. So I guess I'll just kind of jump in a little bit of some of the bills that I filed that you've just mentioned. The first one, you know, and before I even jump into that, it's just to say that, you know, again, we're looking at another day has gone by with more mass shootings in our country. And I think it's hard to just jump right in to just talk about a bill. And it's just to say that your being on this virtual gathering is, you know, what is happening around the country. And I think the good news is that the truth is it's what you're doing right now. It's actually making a difference, and legislatures around the country have been addressing the laws and have been changing the laws. And so I'm going to talk about, you know, I came into this space because I filed a bill on ERPO, and the red flag bill 4 or 5 years ago. And filing that bill was really, it did two things for me. One is that it was amazing to see the power of the NRA up front, and to see it right up front in Massachusetts. The fact that I had the audacity to use my, to just use words and talk about this bill, and remember, this is pre-Parkland, that alone incited the Massachusetts NRA, which is referred to as GOAL, Gun Owners Action League, which I think is a misnomer, because it really is a chapter of the NRA. That does not mean that all the members who are members of GOAL subscribe to the NRA, but certainly the leadership is. Just by talking about that bill, which was really about taking guns out of homes in which somebody was proven or suspected of being suicidal, or that they would hurt themselves, you know, that lit a firestorm in which I had to have police detail, police protection for almost 2 weeks around the clock, and you know, had to have it at my kids' school. And I didn't talk about it for many, many months while it was happening, because you don't talk about it when it's happening, because you just need it to go away. But it was the first lesson of, you know, and I think where we are 5 years later, it doesn't surprise anyone, but just to see how far that they would go to silence and intimidate lawmakers. And typically this was what we found out later, is that this was happening across the country, and it was happening predominantly to female legislators who were leading the way on having common sense gun ownership laws in place. So one realized that being silenced and being intimidated was not going to work for me, nor does it work for many advocates like you and women who are leading their state legislatures around the country. The other thing that I learned before I go into is that gun laws enough aren't changing the laws around gun ownership is really important, and that's why Massachusetts has the most comprehensive common sense gun ownership laws in the country, and we have the lowest rate of gun homicides. Those low rates of gun homicides are of no consequence to families who continue to lose loved ones to gun violence. We lost a young person this summer in Cambridge. 6 people in Boston have lost their lives in the last 2 months to gun violence. And so it's also, for me, the other space that I've stepped into, which is not included in the bills that we're talking about today, but it's about also supporting both victims and survivors of gun violence. And that includes individuals, family members, but it also includes neighborhoods and schools and the whole surrounding ecosystem of anyone who's been impacted by gun violence. And that's why it really is a public health issue, because it really it takes an effect on all of us. And so I've done a lot to work with community-based organizations that are both working with survivors and also working often with victims and the victims' families. And this piece that I'm talking about, and I will go into the bills right now, but I can't underscore it enough, because they actually don't get the kind of support that many of the organizations that are doing the kind of advocacy and lobbying around changing gun laws get. So I think of the Louis D. Brown Institute. Tina Sherry has had a profound impact around Massachusetts in working with survivors of gun violence. And I've worked with her when I was a city councilor, and we lost members of our community to that. But I can tell you that they also really struggle to raise financial resources, even though they're the ones on the ground working with families across the state, from everything to how do you plan a funeral to how do you do safety planning, because one shooting and even a homicide does not mean it's the end of the violence for people in that family. So and then there's organizations like UTEC and ROCA, and I just have to really, I made the commitment to myself and to them in my own heart that whenever I would come on and talk about advocating for gun laws, we really also need to make a commitment to understand more about community-based organizations on the ground that are working with survivors, working with families, and working with perpetrators and their families, because that is the key to really reducing recidivism and gun violence and all forms of violence. So I'll say that, and now I'll go into the bills that we're working on now. So we filed this bill, and I'm sorry, my colleague, Representative Frank Miranda out of Lawrence, had something else that he could not get out of right now, but wanted to be here. He and I together filed this bill that essentially would say Massachusetts, as many of you know, is a state that does not allow people to buy semi-automatic weapons. In 2004, when the federal ban on assault weapons expired, Massachusetts and a handful of other states around the country decided to, in fact, extend that ban. So, and only then was it that Smith & Wesson, which was not in the business of manufacturing assault weapons and selling them to private citizens under different leadership and corporate leadership, did Smith & Wesson then transition into the business of producing assault weapons for the purpose of selling to private citizens, even though they could not do it here in Massachusetts. And so the idea behind this was really simple, is that we have gun manufacturers in Massachusetts that are producing weapons that have been used to murder and kill people at once across the country, in the state that they are produced in, they couldn't do here. I have, some of the things that you may already know is the assault weapon that was used in Parkland, made here. The assault weapon that was used in Aurora, made here. And the list goes on and on. And families and survivors of those communities have also come together with me to support this bill. And you referenced the kind of the theatrics, and it is theatrics of Smith & Wesson claiming that they were leaving the state because the idea of this bill existed. It's nonsense. Smith & Wesson was already closing. It doesn't explain why they closed down their plant in Missouri or Connecticut. This move and this migration south was all about economic benefits for them, going to a place that actually did not require them to pay the same wages and benefits. And The bill does not prohibit them. So what the bill will do is it prohibits them from manufacturing assault weapons for the purpose of selling to private citizens anywhere in this country. It does not prohibit them from manufacturing those weapons and selling them to law enforcement and to the military. And in fact, they still have a large bulk of their company and their jobs that are staying at the moment in Springfield. But this was really a press release moment for them, and it was completely manufactured, feign and economic anxiety on their part. They've been already doing this for years. So that bill is still pending. We're still waiting to get a hearing on it, and we expect it will go through judiciary in both the Senate and the House. And we expect a hearing somewhere in the next 6 to 8 weeks. It has to happen. So I really hope that you will continue to join us. And as we work to say that, no company in Massachusetts should be able to profit off of a weapon that was never intended for private citizen use ever. We have blood on our hands. As long as we allow this to happen. So that is that's one of the bills you referenced. And then the ghost bill. So this is a bill.
Excuse me, Representative Deckers. Sorry, one question. Can you give us the name on that bill just to put it in people's heads? So
yeah, you know what I'll do actually? I have Sarah, who is my legislative director. She'll put it in the chat section.
Okay, Sarah. Great. Thank you so much.
Sarah will do that. So then a couple of years ago, I filed an act relative to ghost guns, which would prohibit unlicensed individuals from assembling their own firearms and would promote public safety by requiring 3D printed guns contain enough metal to be detected in a security screening. This was done based on in 2018 for me. I've been very aware of ghost guns and had not been working on it until in 2018, a Cambridge man faced 40 charges after police seized nearly 30 guns, plus gun parts, hundreds of rounds of ammunition. And this was done by with over 30 mail deliveries brought to his house. And so this bill would require a few things to happen here. It would require them to traditionally firearms affixed with a serial number or some other kind of identification that can trace it from its manufacturer to the point of sale, allowing law enforcement to trace the origins of firearms used in crimes. Obviously, with a ghost gun, you don't have to do that. But what we've said for this is that when a gun manufacturer mails a piece to you, and Sarah, I don't think we have actually all of the right summary of this bill up in front of me. But what it does, so people know, is that it actually would require gun manufacturers to know that the person in Massachusetts is licensed to actually carry. And it would still have to have an identifying number, and it would have to be reported to the state so that we know we have data that somebody is actually mailing in pieces to build guns. And so those are two bills. And that was incredible work and collaboration between a really savvy postal carrier who noticed something was up and the Cambridge Police Department, who worked collaboratively to figure that out. And I believe, I don't have the number in front of me, but there are a handful of those guns were assembled to be, I believe, AK-15s, assault weapons, in addition to handguns. And the idea was that those weapons were going to be sold on the streets. So those are two bills, but there's a lot of other bills that I'm working with some of you and some of the advocates on as well to really continue closing a loophole around domestic violence and folks who have guns in their homes. We have, anyway, I'll stop because I could talk about the other half dozen and there's more people on here. So clearly it is a public health crisis. It's one that our country astonishingly keeps closing its eyes to. But I will say that for me, the red flag bill that I worked on to, and these were areas that I was interested in, but I wasn't a leader on working on issues around gun ownership and gun violence. My policy areas were really around poverty and labor and children's mental health. This was an issue that often as a legislator, you don't always pick the issues that you lead on. And I worked with students in my community who asked me to file this bill, and it was in reference to one of them whose best friend continued to buy guns and was suicidal in their home state, and eventually was able to buy a gun and kill himself. So that was the origins of ERPO, but based on that experience for me, it really has thrusted me into a much deeper dive of understanding what it will take for both Massachusetts to continue being a model and to continue supporting both programs, communities, and laws, additional laws that really will, so that we really can, I can look at my kids, I can look at any of your kids, your grandchildren, and kids whose communities continue to be ravished by gun violence and say, yes, we are actually trying to do everything we possibly can do. Everything's on the table. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And I very much appreciate your observations of recognizing the victims and the communities, neighborhoods that are affected. In nonviolence, we emphasize the connectedness of all human beings. And so when a person is shot, it's not just the person, it's all who lived and loved. And so that is a beautiful, thorough way to deal with this violence. I'm going to turn the mic now to Joanna McGugan. She is the co-leader for the Central Mass chapter of Moms Demand Action. They are a grassroots group doing a number of campaigns addressing gun violence. Joanna's going to talk about that, and then we'll pass the mic to her colleague, Dr. Peter McCarnady, who is a physician, a family doctor, and will speak about specifically about gun violence and public health. So Joanna, welcome.
Thank you so much, Claire. And thank you, Representative Decker, for all the work that you're doing in the State House. And I'm really happy to see so many red Moms Demand shirts here tonight. I'm really thrilled to have your support. We are a nonpartisan grassroots organization. We are gun violence survivors. We are change makers. We're advocates. We're working hard to create a future free from gun violence. And we work in many different areas. We work on the local, state, and federal level to pass and enforce gun laws that will save the most lives. And we have several legislative priorities that are currently circulating in the State House. I'll go over a few of them towards the end. But we also promote and educate about safe gun storage and responsible gun ownership. We support local allies in their efforts to disrupt the root causes of gun violence. These community-based organizations that Representative Decker mentioned, we partner with them to help support their work in any way that we can. We work to elect gun sense candidates to public office across the country. We've had tremendous success doing this. And we raise awareness about gun violence. We have our annual Wear Orange events every June. We raise awareness about the red flag laws. We are a leader, excuse me, we're a leader in that issue. And that's something we want to see at the national level. So we're working hard because it's an amazing law, but it won't save lives if people don't know about it. So we're working hard to spread awareness of that. And we raise awareness about other proven evidence-based solutions to prevent gun deaths. So I just wanted to share some statistics to help contextualize the laws that we're talking about and the violence that we're seeing. The reality is 100 people are killed every day from guns. Over 230 more are wounded. And many of those tragedies don't make the headlines. We do hear about the school shootings. We hear about the mass shootings. But when we're talking about death by gun suicide or gun deaths in Black and Brown communities, they don't make the headlines. And that is the majority of firearm deaths. Our goal is to end gun violence in every form, in every community. So you can see that the COVID pandemic has had a terrible impact on the gun violence crisis. There were almost 4,000 more firearm deaths and almost 10,000 more firearm injuries in 2020 compared to 2019. Federally licensed gun dealers requested nearly 40 million background checks since the pandemic began, and that's a 40% increase from 2019. Everytown estimates that people purchased 22 million guns in 2020, and that is a 64% increase over 2019. So that's really concerning. We've also seen historic levels of gun violence in cities in the past year. So there are a lot of myths about gun violence. One is that mass shootings and school shootings make up the bulk of gun deaths, when really the picture is very different. Mass shootings plus school shootings make up less than 0.5% of gun deaths. So this is a breakdown of gun deaths from 2013 to 2017. You can see that the majority are actually suicides, 61.2%. Homicides make up 34.9%. And less than 0.42% were mass shootings or gunfire on school grounds. So another myth is that gun violence affects all Americans equally. But if you start by looking at firearm suicide, white Americans represent 77% of the US population, but 87% of firearm suicide victims. And it's important to know that suicide makes up the vast majority of gun deaths, over 60%, as we've seen. If we look at homicides, it has a disproportionate impact on Black Americans. The causes for this are many, and they're very specific to our country's history of discriminatory policies that have left Black and Hispanic people in segregated communities with high rates of poverty, unemployment, and incarceration. And when they're concentrated, these factors are strong determinants of violent crime. And this helps us understand better why young boys and men of color living in impoverished, racially homogeneous neighborhoods within cities are the leading victims of gun homicides and assaults. So the third myth is that there's nothing you can do to prevent gun violence. And you can see, if you look at New York State, they've seen a substantial decrease in gun deaths from their strong gun safety policies. They've gone down 24%. Oops. And you see the opposite happening in a state like Missouri, where gun safety policies have been repealed or weakened. Gun deaths have actually increased. Here in Massachusetts, we have an average of 244 gun deaths in an average year, with a rate of 3.4 deaths per 100,000 people. We do have the lowest rate of gun deaths in the country. Everytown ranks us 51st. If you're including Washington, D.C., we're 51st in the nation for gun violence. But we're also a leader in gun safety laws, and this is not a coincidence. So we still have work to do to keep our communities safer. There are a number of bills that are that we are supporting, and a few of them are here. Actually, this is everything we're supporting in the current session. They cover a lot of different subjects. The ghost guns, bills 2491 and H 2439 would address the dangers of ghost guns. Bills H 2505 and S 1562. I won't list them all because they're on the slide, and I'm happy to share more information about any of these with you. But these are our priorities at the moment. Requiring live firearm training. Our state currently to obtain a firearm license or permit you do have to take gun safety training, but that training is not required to have live firearm training as a component. So we want to make sure that anyone who has a permit for a firearm is properly trained in discharging weapons, in handling them safely. Two bills that would expand Massachusetts crime gun data. Since 2014, crime gun data has been collected and reported, but it needs to be analyzed. We need to have a system in place for analyzing that data to help law enforcement to trace gun trafficking patterns and solve crimes, and to help legislators construct effective policies. And finally, two bills that would create alternatives for alternative dispatch programs in Massachusetts that would help to de-escalate violence, volatile situations. They would send trained professionals to certain cases that would not involve police arrests. So it's looking at alternatives there to help prevent police deaths. So that's a very, very quick overview of MOMS and what we do, and some of the laws that we are currently advocating for. And there's a lot more to what we do, but we only have so much time. So I do welcome any questions you have. You can email me or Peter. And I'm going to turn it over now to Peter to talk about public health and harm reduction. He is a former family doctor and brings a really important perspective to this conversation.
Hi, I'm. What's happening with this audio? Well, I'll try to keep it brief and hope my audio is not too bothersome. My name is Peter McConaughey. I'm a family doctor, and on July 27th, 1983, I went to work at a community health center, and a man walked in, said he had chest pain, and pulled a gun, killed my partner, and shot me 5 times. I've got skin in the game here. As a public health issue, if one defines a public health priority, as the issues that are causing the most deaths in the United States, in the last 2 years, it's COVID. But year after year, the most common way that Black and brown people are going to die is by opiate overdose and firearm violence. This is a huge issue. Every day in the United States, hundreds of people are killed and wounded. The impact of people being wounded may actually affect more people than the number of people who die. This is a huge issue because suicide by handgun is much more successful than suicide by any other method. And yet, no one really talks about the fact that handguns in the hands of desperate people results in a death from suicide, successful suicide. This is an enormous public health issue. And the issue of ghost guns is going to make it much more acute. Currently, hundreds of ghost guns are being recovered in California every year. Just imagine that people who are ineligible to get a license to carry a gun in Massachusetts can go online, buy a kit, and make their own untraceable, powerful, lethal weapon if we do not regulate ghost guns. I see that Seth Kaplan has mentioned in the chat that we all know about ghost guns. Seth, I hope that's true, but I don't think it is. Information about ghost guns and why they're important and why they're untraceable and why they are particularly tempting to the very people who can't get a license, gang members. It's easier for gang members to get a ghost gun kit and build one themselves than it is to steal it. It's a huge problem. And Representative Decker has been at the forefront of pushing for more effective legislation like the red flag law. And it was no surprise to me to see her name associated with a legislation to regulate ghost guns in Massachusetts. I'm sure Dr. Hirsch, as the head of the health department in Worcester, can speak more eloquently than I can about the public health issue. Finally, I would like to say that fundamental to a public health approach is the idea of harm reduction. The analogy here is that if you're going to drive a car 60 miles an hour or 100 miles an hour, at least if you have a crash, your chances of surviving are much better if you wear a seatbelt. And the equivalent in firearm legislation is to keep guns out of the hands of people who are likely to misuse them. And ghost guns are like harm reduction in reverse. So I'll sign off. Thanks. Sorry for the audio.
You were fine. Thank you so much. I want to give, as you suggested, Dr. Hirsch, an opportunity to add a few words. And I'm particularly interested in the ability of physicians to educate their patients on gun risks. You know, is that permissible in Massachusetts? And so Dr. Hirsch, if you want to, we're putting you on the spot here.
Thank you very much, Claire. I'm honored to be here. I'm always honored to be on a panel with Dr. McConerty. I think he is just an amazing person to have shown the resilience that he did and to continue to contribute to public health in so many ways that he's not even telling you about, not just gun advocacy, but in the COVID fight and all the other things that he has contributed to the community. I'm really grateful to be here. So the great thing that we have at least going for us here in Massachusetts is that in 2012, when the state of Florida tried to pass a gun gag law for doctors, that doctors were not allowed to speak about firearms at all unless the person actually came in with blood dripping from a gunshot wound. There was a very courageous young pediatrician named Judy Schechter who got a federal injunction to stop the enforcement of that law. And that put the law in limbo for 5 years while it wrangled through the court system. Twice, the law was upheld by a mini panel of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in Atlanta. But on the third try in 2017, the entire panel of the 11th Circuit voted in favor of overthrowing that law. And that only happened because the hearing was on the Monday after the Pulse nightclub shooting. And the state of Florida didn't even elect to send even a third or fourth level assistant attorney general to advocate for the laws staying in place, because they knew it was a ridiculous law. And the opportunity that gave us in 2017 and henceforth was to drive a truck through this by getting our young physicians in training, getting our young nurses in training to be able to address this problem with families before it became a crisis of actual gunfire. So what I've been laboring to do quite intensely at UMass, where we have our med students and graduate nursing students kind of in a very nice way doing interdisciplinary kind of education, is to talk to them about how to talk to patients about guns and how to talk to them about getting rid of guns if they make a simple evaluation. We want every patient that says, "Oh yes, I have a gun in the home," to make a risk-benefit equation for themselves. So if they have a gun in the home, maybe they've had a gun in the home for a long time, but now something has changed. What might have changed? Inquisitive toddlers roaming through the home, depressed teenager living in the home, abusive or angry spouse living in the home, demented elderly person living in the home, someone with a substance use disorder problem living in the home. All of these have been shown to elevate the risk of gun ownership, especially if you don't store the weapon securely. So we want to have that conversation with every single patient, if possible, that has a gun. And we want them to then have an avenue if they decide that they agree the risk is too much to have that gun, to have a way of disposing of that gun. That's the piece that's been missing in many, many communities. And that's why I've been an advocate for gun buybacks for over 20 years. I started my first gun buyback in 1994 in Pittsburgh. This year will be the 20th year for our gun buyback in Worcester. In Pittsburgh, they've collected 13,000 guns since 1994. In Worcester, we've collected almost 4,000 since 2000. And I am very grateful for the kind of community that we live in, and that we have police departments. It's not just the Worcester Police Department anymore. There's 25 cooperating smaller municipalities with their police departments that are collaborating with us. And our district attorney, first DA Conti, and then his successor, DA Early, who have been absolute champions of the notion that an unsecured weapon in the home is a public health problem. And this is all as exactly what Peter was talking about here, the lethal means reduction. That's what we're after, right? If you have a gun in the home and your suicidal ideation kind of comes to a head, the success rate of committing suicide goes way up. You have a gun in the home, you're angry, and you're having an argument with your spouse, that becomes a domestic violence fatality, and frequently a fatality and a suicide fatality. Murder-suicide stems from that. So I won't belabor this because I know I'm talking to the choir here. Joanna has been kind enough to participate in a number of the educational events that we've had for the medical students, and I'm always very grateful for that. We've had help from our terrific Attorney General. We've had help from Representative Linsky. I haven't had the pleasure of meeting Representative Decker, but I'm a big fan already based on what you've said today. We're also very fortunate that our city manager and our police department here in Worcester have been just really leaders in pushing this forward every year. They want to do this on behalf of the city. So I think that the gun violence problem is a very multifactorial, not one size fits all. We've got the mass shootings, as Joanna's slide showed. We have the school shootings. We have shootings that are black on black violence. We have domestic violence shootings. We have unintentional toddler or sibling shootings. And then we also have the suicides. And I don't think it's a cookie cutter thing, but the one unifying thing is that if you can get those people that are at risk for any of those things I mentioned to disarm, you will reduce the likelihood of fatality. So that's the public health approach that we've taken here in Worcester. We're aligned now with Springfield in the west, Hartford and New Haven, San Mateo, California, Albuquerque, New Mexico. We also have folks in Redwood City, California, and San Francisco. They're all going to be participating in our December 11th gun buyback. What I would love to see would be, first step, a Commonwealth-wide gun buyback day, much like the drug take-back day that the DEA does. Give people the opportunity to disarm. It would be a wonderful opportunity. And no questions asked is the key. You got to get the amnesty so that people aren't feeling like as soon as they turn it in, they're going to get traced. And then taking it from there, I'm a member of the coalition called the Injury Free Coalition. We have 44 sites nationally. I think we could make this into a national gun buyback day. And that would bring, I think, the right kind of attention as to how a gun in the home has to be looked at as a public health menace unless it's stored properly and unless people make that evaluation, that risk evaluation that I mentioned. So I'll shut up. Sorry.
Thank you very much. That was extremely concrete from all of you. We have heard a lot tonight that I hope gives people a sense of possibility and empowerment. And I'm going to open it up to questions. There's been references to bills, the multi-faceted campaigns of Moms Demand Action. December 11th, Dr. Hirsch mentioned his gun buyback. different ideas of how to approach this problem that really bedevils our people, our beloved American people. So any questions? If you want to, I didn't think through how we would do the questions. I think you can just, let's try opening it up. Just if you have a question, you can unmute yourself to ask.
Claire, I'm just going to jump in. I think a couple of things that were said here are important, right? The common denominators are access to guns, who has access to guns, the kind of training they have, and the storage, right? If the rest of the country had laws that mirrored Massachusetts laws, it would be very different. There would be a lot less guns, and there also would be in the hands of people who are trained and more responsible. And the storage would also be more secure. You know, we're finding out about this latest Michigan shooting, right? Was that this is a person who stole his dad's gun, who just bought the gun days before this mass shooting. And then the other thing is about, yeah, it's just who has guns and the number of guns. There are so many guns in our community. Cambridge is, you know, not immune. Right now we are dealing with in the pandemic, we knew that the after effect of the pandemic, with all of our young people essentially being kept home for an entire year, we are seeing both behavioral health issues, and the issue is that, you know, the NRA loves to tie mental health issues. The only time they actually care about mental health or behavioral health is when it's about like trying to prevent a common sense gun ownership law moving forward. But we know that when people are struggling with behavioral health, they're not making the healthiest choices in that moment, right? And that is the high rates of suicide that exist when somebody's struggling with depression and has a gun. And we are seeing guns really in places with young people in Cambridge today that are really frightening. And that's just happening around the state. So we're not an island as part of the challenge, right? Massachusetts is not an island. There was a shooting a couple of years ago and somebody was murdered in Cambridge, and the person purchased that gun 5 hours before they came back to Cambridge to shoot somebody, and they purchased it in Maine. So they drove to Maine, 5 hours later drove to Cambridge. And this is true of any of our communities, certainly true of Worcester. It's true of so many of our communities. And I think that's part of the greater challenge. And it's why it's so important that so many of you are involved in organizations and talking about this. It's about what we do here in Massachusetts, and we have data and we get to prove that it works. And then it's also about, you know, working across the country to get those same kinds of common sense laws in place.
Great, thank you. Well, while people are pondering questions, I have three that I will throw out. And the first one, there's been reference to the red flag law. If you could, one of you could please explain, you know, what that is. And Representative Decker, you mentioned the where these bills are in process. If you could restate that, and at what point in that process do legislators look for public input to show that there's concern? And the third question is for the public health people. Is there ever effort to, if you consider gun stores a point of access, where there is information on what to think about that survey that doctors give patients? I'm thinking when you buy a product that has a plastic bag, you know how it says this bag is not a toy, and there's sort of like a public health advisory on there about, you know, make sure you don't have it in reach of children. But has there ever been attempt at the point of purchase at the gun stores to provide that kind of public health like you'd get on a packet of cigarettes, you know, not good to do when you're pregnant or whatever. So those are three questions, but maybe we could take the bill and red flag first.
I'll just say the red flag, also known as ERPO, Extreme Risk Protection Order. If just like similar to a restraining order, if you believe somebody in your home is at risk of hurting themselves, which is primary where the law came from. It was really about suicide prevention, and has become now over the years about also if you believe someone in your family, in your home is going to go out and hurt somebody else with that gun, you can now go straight to a judge and ask the judge to temporarily remove the gun and ammunition from that person's possession. And prior to that, it was left to local police chiefs and police commissioners to make that call on their own. Some made the right call and some didn't. And that is why we had overwhelming support from police commissioners and chiefs around the state supporting this law, who believed that it really needed to be someone else who made that call. So that bill is saving lives in Massachusetts. And then in terms of the number of the bills, what I would just say is that if you want to share emails with me, or we could send an email to you, we'd be happy to give you a better idea. But your legislators always want to know what your take is on any bill, right? And so it doesn't even matter where it's in the process. So it's never too late or too early to reach out and talk to your reps and your senators about what you think. Most of the bills that I filed, I probably have about a dozen bills that I filed that address directly gun violence. Most of those were heard in public safety just a couple of weeks ago. So they're in committee, and all bills that are in committee right now, like I chair the Public Health Committee, we have to report all of our bills out by February 2nd, or we have to ask for an extension. But the goal is by February 2nd, we have to decide the bill should move on in the legislative process, or it should go to study, or it should not go anywhere. It should die because it's a bad bill. Most bills either move on, or actually most bills go to study because we don't pass thousands and thousands of new laws every year. And so now is the time to really let your legislator know that any of these bills are important to you, because they are, their staff is deciding which bill in the piles of bills that are before them that they should further study. And I can tell you one of the things that I do, I have one of the highest number of bills in my committee for public health. If the legislator hasn't reached out to me, hasn't provided testimony, hasn't called, text, emailed me, and nobody else has, unless I am personally interested in that bill, it gets put into a pile that's probably going to go into study. Because I have 3 staff people, like most committees do, trying to go through hundreds of bills and do all of our due diligence. So I just encourage you to reach out to your legislators now, and we're happy to provide you with more specific information about bills and bill numbers, and even sort of how to make a call, how to advocate. But your legislators want to hear from you. They do.
Thank you. So for the Worcester people, it's Mary Keefe, whom I think would be quite supportive.
Well, Mary and Jim O'Day and
Okay.
Dan Donahue, you actually have quite a few House reps out of
Okay.
Worcester, all very good.
Great. So then the last question had to do with at point of sale. Is there any effort to give public health information about the product?
So I can just say, Claire, if you don't mind taking that question. Dr. David Hemingway and Kathy Barber from the T.F. Chan School of Public Health at Harvard have been working on a project for several years in the gun stores in New Hampshire, giving out pamphlets initially to gun buyers, focusing really on suicide prevention issues. And I think they've produced a very short video about this topic now, that the gun owners who are willing to cooperate, it can't be legislated in New Hampshire, no way. But if the gun shop owner agrees, they can have it running kind of on a loop on a laptop sitting on their counter when these purchases are made. And they have studied this, and I would say that the presentations I've seen have been very enthusiastic about it, but I don't think it's moved the needle on the actual numbers of suicides, firearm suicides, certainly in New Hampshire. I don't know whether they keep track of where these gun owners are coming from. So some of them obviously are coming from Massachusetts because it's so much easier to get a gun up there than here in Massachusetts. But I think there's mixed messages. I think it's, in theory, it's a great idea, but in practice, there's a tremendous amount of peer pressure when you go into a gun store to look like you've been there before, you know, to look like you've got the swagger to be in there and get your Sig Sauer and be, you know, really cool about it. And I'm not sure that this will play very well. You can never say never, but so I'm a little bit skeptical on that whole process. I wish instead that people would be instructed at these gun stores how to apply a gun lock or encouraged to buy a gun safe or some storage mechanism at the same time. You know, it's like buying a car without seatbelts in it or something like that. You really should be required to do both. But it would really take a village to get that kind of legislation passed anywhere but in Massachusetts. I think people like Representative Decker could do it here, but I'm not sure that it would pass in any of the surrounding states where it's so easy to get guns.
I wouldn't assume it would pass here either. It really becomes, I think the point you just made is how effective is it? And all of us as legislators, we have to pick and choose our priorities, right? We can't have 100 priorities. And even in the dozen bills that I've filed that deal with gun ownership, gun violence, you know, within that I have my priorities. And so legislators really do try to, and if you want it to be a priority, it can become a priority for your legislator, but you have to make sure that you know that and you really are going to stay on top of it. So I've worked on bills that weren't my priorities. I'm not sure they're the priority of my entire district, but when a constituent has made it their priority to stay on top of me and work on it, it becomes my priority.
So we have a question here. Is there legislation regarding the high rates of suicide among vets? Which I'm assuming the means in that is guns.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, there are a number of bills that deal with both commissions around PTSD. I chaired last session the Committee on Mental Health and Substance Use and Recovery. My dad did 2 tours in Vietnam and was diagnosed only when I was in my 20s as having severe PTSD and passively suicidal. Like, thank God we didn't have a gun in our house. So I think the issue is that there's different bills that are dealing with how to support veterans who have mental health challenges, and it's both. I mean, that's going to be done on so many different levels. And I was just reading a story yesterday of a classmate of mine from Harvard. I went to the Kennedy School, and classmate of mine who really high-ranking officer in the military, who last year was, and he's done several tours abroad. He actually worked closely and carried the codes for President Obama. He was suicidal, and but prior to becoming suicidal, he actually turned the gun on to his family and to his wife. And he actually just wrote, I'll send it. He wrote a really powerful piece about it yesterday, which is the first time that I knew. And then I Googled to get the rest of the story. And the police had to talk him down. He's facing court-martialing. He's facing all kinds of things right now, and he's on trial, and he's accepting responsibility for that. But a large part of that is this military culture where, you know, we don't allow those who've been traumatized, like, you don't go to war, you're not involved in conflict and don't come back somehow changed. At least that's not the experience that my dad and many of people I've talked to have actually gone to, who've been in conflict. And until we destigmatize and until the military forces this to be part of our overall health, right? Until like your mind is as essential as your eyes and your teeth in terms of your care, then that's really, so I think the stuff around veterans and suicide, it's everything that we talked about in terms of common sense gun ownership laws. It's about, you know, but it's also about, it's a different issue as well. It's really about understanding the unique behavioral health and mental health needs that we consciously ignore systemically.
So
I just posted in the chat as well, President Biden's plan for addressing veteran suicide, and
Yeah.
the focus seems to be on safe. Well, one of the focuses is on safe gun storage and education around that. But it's very, very comprehensive, and it's very strategic, I believe, in not alienating gun owners and veterans in that population that is experienced with guns and possesses guns and enjoys collecting guns. So it's a very very well thought out piece. If you want to give it a read, I put the links in the chat. And I had a question for Dr. Hirsch. When or where is the gun buyback this year?
Sorry. The main collection point is the Worcester Police Headquarters on Lincoln and Belmont Street from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. But we have, and I can try to send it to you, we have a flyer with the other distribution points. We have the Auburn Police, the Barry Police, the Dudley Police, Fitchburg Police, Leominster Police, Northborough Police, Northbridge Police, Spencer Police, all doing similar hours. 10 to 2 is, I think, from these peripheral points, more common than 9 to 3, like we're doing in Worcester. But and each of the sites are staffed with a special armorer that the police departments will use to determine the value of the gun and if it's operable, if it's loaded. We have a med student that will be there that will be administering the reimbursement. And also there's a volunteer survey that we asked the participants to do. It's still anonymous, no questions asked in terms of, you know, demographics, more just how did you hear about us? Why did you come? Those kind of things. And we do the same survey in all those cities that I mentioned. And our hope is that, you know, we can publish kind of a multi-institutional or multi-municipal paper with some of the results. We've been collecting data now in that way since 2009. So the pandemic last year reduced our productivity quite a bit. We only collected 26 guns last year, but I'm hoping people will be coming out this year unless the Omicron crisis gets worse.
do you have a like a flyer or a sheet that sort of gives those locales or?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Should I send it to you?
Yes, if you could, because we will send, the center will send a recording of this event. And I'm thinking, Rochelle, if we can just put a link that lists the locales for the gun buyback with that when we distribute it to everyone on our email list. So,
Great,
so
great.
yes, if you could send it.
Sure.
Are there any other questions? We are
Claire.
Yep, go ahead.
Yes, I want to thank everyone. After reading news like what we did in the last couple of days, it's very depressing. And this information was very hopeful and very practical and very concrete. As someone who grew up really watching hundreds and hundreds of war movies, when I finally went to 6 war zones, I was astonished how misinformed the media had made me and how much more common civilian death was and how much more common friendly fire injuries are. And similarly on the gun issue, I think TV programs and films have really sold the message that if people are fearful, a gun is their savior. And that when crises come up like COVID, like increase in fear because of domestic violence and so on, people go out to buy a gun and they're just ignorant of the fact that it's more likely to kill a family member than an intruder. And I wish we could break through to the media in such a way that so that we could cross the threshold that I think we've crossed a little bit about domestic violence and about racism, so that the broader public is aware that guns are problematic and they are much less likely to protect you than they are to harm you and your loved ones.
Thank you. And our efforts at the center is to give people another method of conflict resolution, because the gun is presented as the quick fix tool, as Scott said. So we want to teach people other way. Any more questions? We really thank you so much, panelists. Ken here has said this was the best session of its kind, very, very informative. We have time for one more question. Otherwise, we'll sign off and send everyone the recording. I don't know if I see everybody on this page. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Representative Decker, Joanna, Dr. Peter McCarnity, Dr. Hirsch. I should say Dr. McGugan, because Joanna, I know you've got your PhD as well. So thank you. You've really given very specific and concrete ways to think about this. And we will send out a recording for those who couldn't get to this event, and we'll try to include some links on this one to give people resources.
Thank you so much, Claire. This was a really great conversation.